Hello everybody, today we're going to be taking a look at Dorothy Parker's biography, in particular her career and personal life, and seeing how this can sort of alter our analysis of her short story, The Waltz. I hope you enjoy. Dorothy Parker's bibliography is interesting when we think about it in relation to The Waltz, which is one of her short stories. The story itself is relatively straightforward. It's a depiction of a woman being forced to dance with a terribly clumsy man. The woman depicted in the story was essentially forced to dance with the man because of social expectations and her inability to say no or show any sort of disrespect, because women didn't do that back then. According to our on-cue modules, the protagonist is represented with both sympathy and detached irony. The protagonist's biting and sarcastic internal dialogue makes it evident that she doesn't want to participate in the dance. The duality of her sympathy and detached irony is a representation of the social restraint on women at that time, where they had to act polite and eager to and for men to save their reputation and avoid any potential punishment. Dorothy was born a whole 2 months early in 1893. She was born at her family's summer home in West End, New Jersey, but she was raised in Manhattan's Upper West Side. She seemed to always have a knack for the arts, as she grew up supporting herself as a pianist at a dance academy. She entered the world of magazine publishing when she sold her first poem in 1914 to Vanity Fair magazine, and she then regularly started writing for Vogue, and in 1917 she took over as theater critic for Vanity Fair. She was a key member of the Round Table, which was a group of writers who traded witticisms over lunch. She was also an inaugural member of the board of editors at The New Yorker, and she contributed to The New Yorker for over a decade. Parker published her first book of poetry titled Enough Rope in 1926, which eventually became a bestseller. Her poetry was marked by its cleverness, but also by the depression that seemed to plague her daily life. She wrote a lot about power dynamics in gender. The power dynamics that Dorothy wrote about, as well as the flapper mentality that seemed to follow her around, becomes particularly important in our analysis of Dorothy's short story titled The Waltz. The young protagonist's internal dialogue vehemently opposes the societal power dynamic between man and woman and the forced niceties that result. The power dynamic is perfectly represented here because the man knows that the protagonist won't stop dancing with him at the risk of social judgment. The character's internal commentary definitely represents the flapper movement that Dorothy was so often associated with when she says things like this. I hate this creature I'm chained to. I hated him the moment I saw his leering bestial face. And here I've been locked in his noxious embrace for the 35 years this waltz has lasted. Is this orchestra never going to stop playing? This is where Dorothy Parker's real-life experiences and views start to heavily influence the way we interpret the text, as we know she's coming from the perspective that opposes male dominance and female oppression, even if that oppression is only in the form of being forced to dance. During the 1920s and the 1930s, Parker began publishing short stories as well. She later moved to Hollywood, where she began working on movies as a screenwriter, and she became very, very active in left-wing political activism, working on anti-fascism refugee committees. Parker's passion for progressive causes becomes evident in The Waltz due to the brutal and shocking honesty of the main character when she describes how she loathes the man she is societally forced to interact with. Parker's commentary draws attention to the pressure that women face to entertain men. Dorothy Parker was also known for her lethal wit, which is on full display in The Waltz when the protagonist lets loose some biting commentary. I don't want to dance with him. I don't want to dance with anybody, and even if I did, it wouldn't be him. He'd be well down among the last 10. Just think, not a quarter of an hour ago, here I was feeling so sorry for the poor girl he was dancing with, and now I'm going to be the poor girl. Dorothy was described as meek and fragile like a child, not quite 5 feet tall with a mop of dark hair. And she described herself as a child as a plain, disagreeable child with stringy hair and a yen to write poetry. Dorothy's personal life is known to be pretty tragic. She lost her mother when she was only 5 and gained a stepmother that she detested. She later lost her father at the age of 20. She never actually received a high school diploma, but she did attend a convent and a finishing school when she was growing up. Dorothy Parker didn't have much luck in love either, as she was divorced twice. In 1917, she married her first husband, who was a stockbroker named Edwin P. Parker. She kept his last name. They divorced a year after their marriage, and he eventually died of a drug overdose. Alan Campbell was her second husband, who was an actor and a writer and was 11 years her junior. They eventually divorced but ended up getting remarried and were off and on until his eventual death. He also happened to die of a drug overdose. Early on in her career, Dorothy Parker didn't really like to drink much, as she was quoted as saying she didn't like the taste of alcohol. This is a strange change, as she later described herself as a drinker with a writing problem. Dorothy Parker also attempted suicide twice. Parker's life was nothing short of tragic. This reflects in the Waltz, as the protagonist seems to have a very negative voice. Obviously, Parker had a lifetime of negative experiences with men, so it seems that the main character's man-hating shtick is the direct result of Dorothy Parker's real-life experience. As critics in this instance, it's important to fall back and recognize that because of her extremely negative experience with men, the analysis behind the Waltz can be skewed due to her deep personal bias against men. The protagonist's opposition to dancing with the man may seem like she disapproves of society, but because of Parker's biography, we can interpret it as just a general dislike towards men, which can lead to misinterpretations. As we've seen, an author's biography can be of great value when we intersect that with literary criticism. Because of Parker's well-known activism and motivations, it's easy to interpret this text as a commentary on the power dynamic between men and women and the societal oppression that women face. However, we were also shown where misinterpretations can happen when we rely too heavily on the author's biography, based on Parker's tragic view of men and how that can skew her message. Overall, it is important to read a writer's work with their biography in mind, because life experience, upbringing, education, and lifestyle can heavily influence the way people write and the message and emotion behind their writing, but it's important to do this within reason. When we read Dorothy Parker's work with her biography in mind, we gain a greater understanding of where she was coming from when she wrote those pieces. For example, we learn that Dorothy's work was often motivated by left-wing political activism, or it was a reflection of her deep sadness and tragic life. This interpretational approach shapes our understanding of women's literature as a field, because Dorothy wrote during a time where women had barely any rights at all. She wrote based on her own experiences and offered an insight into the minds of women at that time. Women writers today are still writing from the same place, fighting for respect and equality in a world that often tries to silence us. Parker's biography proves that despite hardships, women have a voice that demands to be heard. Dorothy Parker made herself heard, and she paved the way for hundreds and thousands of women after her. Thank you very much for watching my vlog. I hope you enjoyed.